So in this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the risk management process and how we do risk management in order to achieve a balance between the cost of various risk management options that we're going to be putting in place in the organization and the benefits that we get from this investment that we're doing, or this expense that we have. So keeping in mind, there's a cost to everything that we do, and there is a cost to doing nothing. So, and there's a limited amount of resources that we have to spend in information security. And so understanding that security is the absence of unacceptable risks, and in this case in information security, so risk related to the use of information in the organization, the information that is important because it has a value to us and it contributes to our objectives and our mission as an organization. So because we don't want to have any unacceptable risks, when we want to be able to manage these risks, and that's the process of risk management. So it's all about making sure that we can protect the assets, and particularly the information assets, to an acceptable level, but at the same time not spending too much money in order to be doing that. So we're going to be doing, when we're going to be faced with risks, there's many different things that we can do. And one of these things is mitigating risk through allocating time, resources, human resources, or implementing different projects that will result in risk mitigation measures, the so-called countermeasures that we're mentioning here on this slide. But we want to do it in a way that is going to allow us to best manage the risks. So that's the idea of having a balanced approach. We're talking about a few things today, and when we talk about risk management, so we're going to be talking about threats. And so threats are potentially bad things that could happen, or factors, hazards that could contribute to eventually making something bad happen. Vulnerabilities, which are the weaknesses, the bugs, the exposure that we have to particular threats in the organization. Risks, which results from the exploitation of a vulnerability by a threat. And so there's the possibility that something of that nature may happen. Then we have a potential risks, and then the impact is the result of that negative risks. So the amount of harm that a threat could cause by exploiting vulnerability. About events, and so events are measurable occurrences, so something happening, the possibility of something happening at some point in time, and that we can measure this thing happening and measure the impact that it could have on the organization. The incident, so that's the actual occurrence of the event. We're going to talk about controls, which are safeguards, and we could have internal controls, which are basically procedures or mechanisms that we put in place within the organization to help us to mitigate the risks. Safeguards, in here we're talking about more about physical mechanisms or technological mechanisms that could be put in place to protect ourselves or to reduce the impact. And then the countermeasures, or specific countermeasures that we're going to be putting in place in the organization. And so control, safeguards, countermeasures are different ways that we can help to protect from our definition of risk being comprised of threats, vulnerabilities, and our exposure to risk. And what we're trying to do as an organization is to reduce the probability, and these are the red arrows here, to reduce the probability of the exploitation of the vulnerability. So that's one of the things that we can do. And then the other place where risk management is going to have an impact is by reducing the impact of the exploitation of the threat, of the vulnerability by a threat. So those are really the two major areas where we're going to be working. So this diagram that I've added in here to the presentation, which is not coming from the course book, but as that you've seen in other presentations that I've made and other discussions that we've had in class. We're looking at here sort of as a summary of the whole thing put together. An event, a hazard, an accident, an attacker, a virus, a cyber criminal, which is a threat, which may be a threat to the organization, can or could exploit a vulnerability, which is a bug, a weakness, or a configuration error, and the potential impact that this will have on the organization or the potential damages should this risk materialize. So should the threat exploit the vulnerability, that makes up our risk exposure. And so the risk exposure being in relation to the CIA triangle or our security objectives, often measured in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triangle. So a violation of that, or a degradation of that, or a loss of those is a potential impact to the organization, is something bad for us. It's something negative for us, which in this case we have potential risks. And so when that is possible. So this is really where we're going to be acting, and what we'll be talking about in this presentation, and overall this week, because we're going to be looking as well, and how do we do quantitative or qualitative risk assessments. What we're really trying to do is to identify potential vulnerabilities, and we've done that in some of the labs in this course. We've looked at different tools that will help us to do that. We'll be looking at the potential threats. And so we'll maybe by doing scenarios or looking at the literature and looking at what's going on in the media, the news, or different sources of information where we can help us to identify potential threats. Looking at frameworks such as the MITRE ATT&CK framework to help us to identify potential threats. And so that's part of the risk assessment will be to do that and to determine, okay, what is the possibility that something like this, that this threat or any of these threats might exploit some of the potential vulnerabilities that we have? And so identifying this potentiality try to figure out, okay, and in some of these, will they be a loss of confidentiality, integrity, availability, maybe a financial loss to the organization? Is there something bad that can happen to us? And if the answer to those three is yes, they all coexist in time and space, then there's potential risk. So that's what we're gonna be doing as part of the first step, which is to identify the potential risks. So this is looking forward to try to identify something before there's actually an incident that happens. And so we're going to be looking to use this information to be able to plan and to think about, okay, how can we handle these kind of activities? So what are the risk handling activities that we're going to do? What are the potential controls or countermeasures or mechanisms or things that we can do by spending some time, spending some money, allocating some resources, doing some IT projects in order to protect ourselves? But in order to do that, we need to think about what are the potential risks that we have to prepare for. And this is something that we need to do on a continuous basis. So this is not a one-off thing. This is something that as an organization you're going to be doing in a continuous loop, never ending, always thinking about, if changes occur in the environment, changes occur in our business environment, does this affect our risk posture? And do we need to rethink do we need to revise, do we need to review our risk management process or decisions? And because the environment continuously changes, and even if nothing changes, then time changes, and so there's always going to be something that's going to mean that we're going to need to. So in a high level, this is what this continuous loop is going to look like. Right? We're going to start with a risk assessment process, and based on the results of our risk assessment process, we're going to put in place some mitigation measures. And then on a regular basis, we're going to evaluate, or we're going to do risk assurance. We're going to have some mechanisms in place to assure us that what we're doing is working, and that that we're going to learn some lessons from that. Think about an audit, for example, internal and external audit process. That's going to give you additional information that's going to help you to rethink about, okay, when the next cycle, I need to revise some of the things that I've been doing. And maybe some of the things that I've been doing weren't very efficient. They didn't do the job that they were supposed to. Or again, as I've mentioned a few times already, maybe the environment has changed. And so that's something that we need to revisit. The process of identifying risks, we're going to develop scenarios. And again, here in the course, I've showed you some examples of different scenarios that I've been using, that I've been building. So we're going to try to identify potential scenarios that can be used. And the use of scenarios is a really good way, because we're doing storytelling. We're trying to think about, what could be the things that could happen, what would be the potential threats, what could be the potential vulnerabilities, what could be the potential impacts of different things happening. And if you remember from our discussion on COBIT and looking at some risk assessment methodologies, we have two basic strategies. We can use a framework like COBIT 5, for example, to provide us some scenarios that are built into the framework, or some ideas of things that can happen that are built into the framework. Or we can just start from scratch and look at, our organization and our type of business or our ecosystem to try to create scenarios based on our reality. So some of the potential ways that this can be done is, doing brainstorming activities, surveys, interviews, working groups, using checklists, or even using historical information, although that has its limits, because, of course, it's not because something has happened in the past that it's a guarantee that it'll happen in the future, and there's always going to be a first time. So something could not have any historical data on, but doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it won't happen or that it couldn't happen. So really, by creating scenarios and strategies like brainstorming and looking at what's going on all over the world in our business, in our type of business, for example, might be a good way to help us to identify potential scenarios and to develop potential scenarios. One of the things that we will be doing, however, is in order to help us to have some historical data, as much as it does have value, so we do want to have that, and because we do want to keep track of what's going on in our organization, so we're going to create this risk register. We're going to create this document in which we're going to, keep track of all the risks that have happened to us, or the risks that we do want to continue, that we want to include in our scenarios, and that we want to include in our risk assessment and our risk identification process. And so in this register, we're going to have things like a description. What would be the impact of this happening, or what was the impact if it's happened before? What is the likely probability of this event occurring? Of course, if it's sure that it will happen, it's not a risk, because then it's a certainty, but it's still something that we would want to be tracking. But we don't manage certainties the same way that we manage probabilities, because if we're sure that something is going to happen, then it's really not a risk management problem. It's an operational issue. It's something that we have to take into consideration as part of our normal business activities. Whereas, in risk, there's always this notion of uncertainty. There's the probability, because it's not a guarantee that it's going to happen. And of course, the more unlikely it is, the less the impact is going to be. But then we'll have other mechanisms that we'll talk about later, like business continuity, incident management, or disaster recovery planning. So should the risk occur, then we'll look at what are the steps to mitigate this risk, what are the steps to take if the event occurs, and how can we rank this risk in relation to all the other risks that we have in the organization. So some kind of prioritization. So once we've identified potential risks, the next step will be to eventually rank it, so prioritize this risk in regards to all the other risks that we've identified, until we get to the following step, which is, of course, the mobilization or mitigation. So the actual action about it. As part of our process, we're going to want to make sure that we're considering emerging threats, things that haven't happened in the past, but that could happen in the near future. Because when we're doing our risk management, we want to be planning for right now, but we're going to be doing this probably at least on a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year perspective. So, is there anything there that can likely change how we're doing things within the next 6 months, within the next year? So we definitely want to include that as part of our process. So some of the emerging threats that we should need to be aware of now, of course, new technologies, changes in culture of the organization, unauthorized use of technologies, particularly with the introduction of and the global adoption of technologies like smartphones, smart TVs, the in-house automation tools, Alexa, and these kinds of things, is really creating technology that is becoming integrated into our business environment. With the extension of teleworking becoming more and more predominant, there's technologies that would not necessarily be in our perimeter, but that that are now part of our business environment. Changes in regulation and laws that are continuously happening, and of course changes in business practices, which are very much out of our control in many cases, as we're seeing with the COVID. So there's also some static environments that need to be taken under consideration that are also have an effect on us. So the SCADA systems, these are the systems that are being used to control utilities and water, electricity, etc. And the embedded systems, so more and more connected objects, the Internet of Things, the Industrial Internet of Things, so connected objects, smart objects, mobile devices, mainframe computers, gaming consoles, which are really computers, and in-car systems as well that are becoming more and more automated, becoming more and more powerful computers as well. So then we get into the aspects of how are we going to assess the risk? How are we going to be measuring this risk? And there's really two basic methods, two basic ways that we can do this. So quantitative, so putting a number to it, usually a dollar value typically is what is used here. Although, as you'll see here in this course, we're using something called a risk indicator rather than a dollar value, because a dollar value can always be a little bit tricky, a little bit difficult to use. And really, the strategy that we're using in this course is we're developing a key risk indicator, or KRI, rather than putting a dollar value. But we're still in the realm of quantitative, so we're putting a number to it. We're in qualitative, which is actually probably the more common approach in cybersecurity, to have a qualitative scale, so like low, average, high, extreme, sort of this kind of strategy, or maybe colors, from like green, yellow, red, orange, like we're doing for the COVID crisis, or purple, so this is here we're more in the qualitative kind of scale. So we're ranking risks based on probability and impact on operations, but we're not actually putting a number to it. So here we're in the notion of a qualitative. So like an ordinal scale, low, medium, high, but definitely not a number value to it. And we can't really easily convert from qualitative to quantitative, although some people do that, and there's some methodologies which aren't really, I don't think, very reliable, and certainly not very scientific methodologies, where they will ask you to evaluate low, medium, high, and then they'll convert that magically somehow to a number. And that is actually pretty common that you see that in methodologies, and that's a little pet peeve of mine. I've been, something that I've been fighting people about for years and years now, because I don't think that's a very scientific approach to do that. But it's better than nothing. That being said, There's also a lot of issues with numerically based quantitative approaches where you're assigning a dollar value when you're assigning a dollar value to something. For example, assigning a dollar value to the impact. Because of all the biases that people have, they will tend to put a high dollar value subjectively on many things that concern them more. Like we tend to be, affected more or over evaluate things that have happened recently or things that have had a significant impact on us directly or indirectly. And so we tend to overestimate those risks when we're doing a subjective estimation and trying to pass this off as a quantitative. There's been many studies about that. There's even been, a Nobel Prize in economics on prospect theory that relates to that, on the framing of how we frame different risks in order so that they suit better our view. So we have to be very careful with that. But but still, again, the two basic strategies, they all have their limitations in different ways. So that can be used to calculate quantified risks is to use the method based on annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. And so in this approach, basically, we start by calculating the asset value. Understanding that an asset is anything that has some value to the organization, either as a tangible value asset or an intangible asset. So really, the first step in risk assessment is to determine all of the organization's assets and their value, and the importance of each asset to the organization's ability to meet its mission. So that's the asset value, which should consider the replacement value of the equipment or system. It should also include factors such as lost productivity, loss of reputation, or customer confidence. So from there, we'll calculate the exposure factor. So this really represents the percentage of the asset value that would be lost if an incident were to occur. So for example, not every car accident is a total loss. Insurance companies have actuaries who will calculate the likely percentage of loss for every claim. So they know the cost of repairs for every make and model of car, and they can predict the exposure factor per claim. And so their predictions won't be right for any single claim, or maybe, accidentally it could, I guess, but it will be right when grouped by the hundreds or thousands of different claims. So that's the exposure factor that the organization has to this particular event. Then from there, we're going to calculate the single loss expectancy, or the SLE. So you can calculate the value of a single loss using two predicting factors. The two preceding factors, right? So if an actuary calculates the EF, or the exposure factor, of a late model SUV is 20%, then every time he receives a claim, all he needs to do is to look up the asset value and multiply by the exposure factor, right? And then you'll have a good prediction of the payout. So this allows the actuary to calculate insurance premiums accurately and reduce the risk of insurance company of losing money. So then we're going to determine how often a loss is likely to occur every year. So this is an annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO, also called the risk likelihood. And some AROs are greater than 1. So for example, a snowstorm in Buffalo or Berlin or Montreal will happen so many times per year, right? So it'll likely happen many times per year. Other are likely to happen far less often. So for example, a warehouse fire might happen once every 20 years. It's very often it's difficult to estimate how often an incident will occur, how often an incident will happen. So sometimes internal or external factors can affect the assessment as well. Historical data does not always predict the future. An incident, such as one stemming from an internal threat, is far more likely during times of employee unrest or contractual negotiation than at other times. And then finally, determine the annualized loss expectancy, or the ALE. So the ALE is the SLE, the single loss expectancy. So the loss when the incident happens, multiplied by the ARO, right? The annualized rate of occurrence. So the ALE helps an organization identify the overall impact of a risk. For infrequent events, the ALE will be much less than the SLE. So for example, if you expect an event to occur once every 10 years, the ARO is 0.10 or 10%. If the SLE is 1,000, then the ALE is only 100, right? So 1,000 multiplied by 10%. On the other hand, if the ARO is 20, indicating the event is likely to occur 20 times every year, then the ALE is 20,000 or 1,000 times 20. So that is one method to use. So by taking the value and multiplying it by the exposure to get the single loss expectancy, then figure out what's the RO, what's the annualized rate of occurrence, and then by multiplying the SLE by the ARO, then we have the annualized loss expectancy. So that is a measure that we can use in a quantitative risk assessment. So that's probably the most common method. That's the one that you're probably going to see the most often. Again, as I've indicated a few times already, I have certainly my doubts to this approach. It's somewhat limited, and it's not particularly scientific. If we're comparing it to the work of actuaries in insurance claims, but in reality, actuaries in doing insurance claims are using much more complex formulas than these. But it's better, certainly better than nothing. But again, I'll be showing you some other ways that we can by using a risk index, or risk indicators in order to do that. So when the other approach is by using a qualitative strategy. So in a qualitative strategy, then we're going to try to assess based on a sliding scale from insignificant to catastrophic for the impact, and a sliding scale for the probability from rare to almost certain. Of course, certain is something that is not a probability anymore. So basically on a scale of 0 to 1, and 0 to 1, so a sliding scale to try to assess where exactly do we position ourselves in there. And so typically we have some kind of matrix that would be used. Again, here in some of our examples in the Q&A sessions and our Zoom sessions, we'll try to look at some of those and try to get an idea of what those actually look like. Based on what's going to happen, what we've identified, we're going to try to look at potential responses. So how are we going to handle negative risks? How we're going to try to reduce them, transfer them, accept them, or avoid them. Those are the 4 basic responses that we have to negative risks. And positive risks, which we also call opportunities, we would deal by exploitation, by sharing, so take advantage of them, basically share them, enhance them, accept them, right? So those are the basic risk responses that we're going to take. So when we're looking at, so of course my focus as part of my job as a risk analyst is on negative risks, and identifying those that are either the likelihood or the impact is so high that I really don't want to do it. So I'm going to recommend to the organization that we don't do this because the risk is too high and we can't accept these risks. But for many things, we'll say, hey, there's a possibility that it might not go as we wish. But, if it does go wrong, the impact is somewhat low. And so, we can live with that. We can accept that because there's a limit to how much money we can spend and how many resources we can allocate. So, there's sometimes we just have to say, you know what, I think we can live with this. So let's accept this risk. In other cases, we're going to get an insurance policy, or maybe we're going to hire an external firm and we're going to outsource some of our activities because, the risk is high and we don't want to accept this risk, but it's something that we have to do. And so we're going to get an insurance policy. We're going to externalize this risk And so that's called risk transfer. Or, of course, if we can reduce the risk by maybe mitigation, internal controls, procedures, processes, maybe changing the way that we're doing things so that we reduce the risk to a level that it fits with our appetite for risk or the risk tolerance of the organization, so we can take an acceptable risk and transform it or mitigate it enough that it now becomes an acceptable risk. That's risk reduction. That's risk mitigation. That's the stuff that is really the core of the job of the cybersecurity professionals, with all the tools and the mechanisms and the processes and the controls that we'll be putting in place. That's this part here, the reducing and mitigation. We really want to bring risks within an acceptable range, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to take the risks and do something with this risk so that what's left once we've done what we're doing, that's called the residual risk, is within the range of what is acceptable to us as an organization. This is going to probably make a lot more sense to you when we're doing the exercises and the simulations with the scenarios, that you'll see a little bit more how this works, because there's the risks before we do anything, and then we think about it, and then we do something about some of it, and then there's the residual risk that is left after. And considering how much we're willing to spend in risk, in resources, money, time, purchasing stuff, doing projects, how much we're willing to spend, we can reduce the risk to be in the range of what is acceptable to us, but we're not going to completely eliminate it. So there's always going to be a residual risk. So that's really what we're trying to do, right? Identifying what is the total risk, and then taking this total risk and putting in place some controls, ending up with some residual risks, which hopefully will be the organization. So as part of that, I've mentioned, controls. So there's going to be administrative controls. So controls that relate to how people do their jobs. And then there'll be some other controls that are going to be more technical in nature, and that are going to be part of the security program that we're going to be putting in place in the organizations. So things like detective controls that identify that a threat has landed in your system, like an intrusion detection system is a good example of that. Some preventive controls. They're going to stop threats from coming in contact with a vulnerability. So like an intrusion prevention system is going to do something once the threat has actually come in to your network, but it's going to block it from reaching the vulnerability. Corrective controls that are reducing the effect of a threat. So when you reload an operating system after it's been infected with malware, you're using a corrective control. Forensics or incident responses are other examples of corrective controls. Deterrent controls, which are actions that so we're trying to deter an action that could result in a violation. So there's a fine line between deterrent control and preventive controls, but deterrent controls merely attempt to suggest that let me try to get this right. I'm trying to read the definition to make sure I explain it properly. The deterrent controls merely attempts to suggest that a subject not take some action, whereas a preventive control does not allow the action to occur. The deterrent controls are valuable when a knowledgeable user needs the ability to perform some action that involves risk. A deterrent control would allow the action after a warning, whereas a preventive control would not allow the action. In short, the decision to choose between a preventive and a deterrent control is often a balance between utility and security. So basically, a deterrent control is like a warning. You want to log in as an administrator, and you really shouldn't because you can do a lot of damage. But sometimes you need to. So it'll give you a pop-up message and say, okay, you're about to do this. You're about to log in as an admin, and you really shouldn't do that. Are you sure this is something that you want to do? Yes or no? Right. So this is the deterrent control. Whereas the preventive control is just going to just stop it. It's just not going to allow you to do it. And though finally, the compensing controls that are designed to address a threat in place of a preferred control that's too expensive or difficult to implement. So we're basically we're doing something else in. So there's also the aspects of physical security, which we're really not going to be talking a lot about here, but it's something that maybe we can address in another forum, discussing the different aspects relating to physical security. But there is a link between physical security and information security, because of course there's a lot of equipment, and this equipment has to be somewhere. And so we need to, think about where this equipment is and how we're protecting that equipment. But of course, in a global sense as well, from an organizational point of view, more and more organizations are not segregating the different categories of security. So often, more and more, physical security, data security, information security, financial security, like in the money, the fiat currency that you have to deal with. All of these things are part of a global organizational security office management system, where and risk is managed from an enterprise level. So we talk about enterprise risk management, whereas informational risk management is one of the components of enterprise risk management. And in that context, there's different aspects relating to that. But for an information security point of view, we do want to worry about protecting the equipment, protecting the people that are part of our information security teams and our information technology teams. So thinking about things like escape plans, escape routes, running some drills, doing some testing to make sure that our fire systems, our fire control systems, our fire alarms, and all of that, and functioning. So we're going to be selecting countermeasures, right? Once we've identified the risk, we've made some kind of decision of what are the risks that we want to mitigate. So what are we going to do? How are we going to fix the flaws, the vulnerabilities, to try to reduce them, try to reduce the likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. So can we eliminate some of these? Can we fix the bugs, basically, the vulnerabilities? Can we put in place some procedures, operational procedures, and access control procedures? Can we develop them? Can we make sure that they're working? Can we provide encryption? Can we improve the physical security? Can we remove the unreliable or the unreliable networks that we're connecting to? Then, of course, another aspect of risk management is going to be to monitor and control the risk response. So if we have the different measures, the different countermeasures, what are they there to solve? Does it work? Does it solve this problem? Or perhaps it creates a new risk. Maybe it adds complexity to the environment, which is making things worse rather than better. Can we certify and can we get accreditations so getting a third party or a third party process or a standard? We talked about. I hope you looked at the material that I've included on the NIST framework, the MITRE attack framework, or the ISO 27000 series of standards, as well as the COBIT material. That's here. It's about getting some kind of certification or accreditation that our security measures, our security program, our security management system is working. And of course, by doing that, we'll also be looking at best practices and doing some exercises and using due diligence. So doing what the best people in the market that are doing this, following their practices and following their recommendations. So I said, although we've done all of these things, still shit can happen. So we got to be careful and we can plan as much as we want, but the best plans often go to waste at some point when reality hits, And that's why we got to think about business continuity. So we got to manage business continuity. So there's really three parts to that. There's going to be the business continuity plan, so the BCP, the disaster recovery plan, and incident management. So how are we going to manage incidents? So typically something happens, we declare an incident, and then once we've looked at the incident, we'll try to, okay, what's the best strategy? And so by developing a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan, right? So if there's a problem, relatively minor, we can still keep working, but we got to do something to make sure that we're working. Business continuity. It's a major event, and we have to take more stringent approach and more drastic measures because it's a major disruption. Then we're talking about more about disaster recovery plan. And so these have to be done ahead of time so that when it actually happens, we know what we should be doing. So we're really going to be executing the plan that we thought about in the past. And they're tested on a regular basis. So it's all really about preparedness. So thinking about, okay, what am I going to do? Right? There's a lot of options that I can have for that based on the requirements of the organization. Maybe I can have what's called a hot site, basically another data center running in real time, and that I can just switch over to the other data center and keep my operations going. Or maybe it's a warm site. It's not fully ready to go, but it's close to, and I need to send people over, load the data, flip the switch, a warm site. Or a cold site. So I just have a contract with an organization that specializes in doing this, and when I need, then I can enact this plan, and then they can set up within a few hours. They can, or depending on how much money I'm willing to pay, and we can get restarted. Right. So there's all these different strategies that I can take. These are all going to be part of this idea. These different plans for allowing me to keep working. So in that process, I'm going to do a different number of things. I'm going to do a business impact analysis. So I'm going to look, so the BIA. So I'm really going to be looking at the business and determine what are the kind of events that could have an impact on my organization and what am I going to do about it. Identifying which are my critical business functions, because once I've done the BIA and I've identified the systems that are more likely to be affected by this, I have to rank them, and I have to identify which are the ones that are more critical, and then which are the ones that are more critical to the business being able to function. The maximum tolerable downtime, so how much can I be down without it causing too much damage? I mean, there's going to be some damage, but at some point it's going to go too far. And I'm going to have, I'm not going to be able to recover from that very well. So what is that maximal tolerable downtime? How much am I willing to accept? Keeping in mind that, the less I'm willing to accept, the more I'm going to have to spend money on making sure that, I can meet I can beat this when something happens. So I'm going to set a recovery time objective, so a time frame for recovering my operations, which obviously should be less than the maximum tolerable downtime, right? Then I'm going to set also a recovery point objective, because there's going to be loss of data, so I've got to be able to calculate, okay, how much data can I accept to loss? Because the recovery procedures are going to be different, whether the amount of data that I can afford to lose. So can I lose an hour? Can I lose a day? Right? How much can I afford? Because obviously, this is going to make a big difference. I mean, when we're going to talk about doing backups or having offsite backups, that's what we're really talking about here. Do I need to do a backup every 30 seconds, every 30 days, or every day? I mean, this is all going to have a significant impact on how much this is going to cost me to implement my disaster recovery plan and my business continuity plan. So I'm going to set up an emergency operations center, commonly referred to as the war room, right? So this is where the recovery team is going to be working from. And this is how we're going to be sort of running our operations when the situation happens. Who's doing what? How can we reach these people? In my days, we used to have beepers or pagers, and people on part of the war room staff would be on call. Now, of course, with cell phones and texting and all that, I guess not exactly done in the same way, but you get the basic idea. Some of the different metrics that we're going to be using to assess the to help us set up is the maximum tolerable downtime, so the MTD. So the maximum period of time that a business can survive with a disabled critical function. The RTO, our recovery time objective, so the amount of time needed to recover a business process. And then the RPO, so the recovery point objective, so the point at which data must be recovered. So this is going to help us to determine what are we going to be setting up, what's going to be the priorities, and how long should we plan, which is directly going to correlate to the cost of the exercise. So doing a business impact analysis, we as security professionals, we should be asking two things. What is it that can affect the business, and how will it affect the business? And so this is something that we're going to do to set a value for each of our business units, so that we can that as it relates to the entire organization, and so try to understand what are the elements that we need to prioritize. And then based on this analysis impact, based on our assessment of what the impact is going to be, then we're going to be able to identify the critical needs, and this is going to help us to prioritize and then to determine. So there's many different critical dependencies that we have to look at. Our information processing capabilities, the personnel, the communication aspects, the equipment, the facilities, all the other functions that relate to it, as well as the relationship that we're going to need to have and establish with our vendors and our suppliers. So from a people point of view, how we will notify them of an incident and its impact. How will we evacuate, transport, and care for employees? Particularly how we're going to be paying our employees. Who will step in if key personnel is incapacitated or unavailable? So basically what's known as succession planning. From a system point of view, what portion of our computing and telecommunication infrastructures must we be able to duplicate immediately? How long do we have? Do we have a minute, an hour, a day? Data? What data are critical to running our business? How will we recover the critical data that's lost? And then property. What items are essential to our business? Things like tools, supplies, and special forms that must be recovered and easily replaced. So in doing that, we're going to create a plan based on our business impact analysis, and we're going to review and we're going to test this plan. And it's very important to be able to test it to make sure that it works, and also to make sure that when we do actually have to do it in a real situation, that we'll be prepared. So to test the BCP, the business continuity plan, and the disaster recovery plan, we're going to need a checklist, a structured walkthrough, simulations, parallel functionalities, and we're going to be simulating full interruptions so we can know what happens, what we're going to be doing when it really happens. And we're going to be doing backups of our data and of our applications. How are we going to deal with the storage media? Where are we going to store this data? What's going to be the locations? How are we going to access it? And making sure that we have backups of our data, of our documentation, but also in some cases. So we can do different types of backups, full backup. So basically a backup of everything that we have to a backup media. Traditionally, this was done on tape, but sometimes CD, DVD, or even discs. And now maybe also the cloud would be an option as well, if we can deal with the security aspects of that. Differential backup. So with the differential backup, we start by making a full backup, maybe like on a Sunday or when there's not much use of our network, when the traffic is lightest. And then every day of the week following that, we're going to back up the changes based on the Sunday's full backup. So as the week progresses, each night's backup, the differential is going to be a little bit longer. The other one is the incremental backup. So here we start with a full backup when the traffic is light. Then each night we back up only what's changed during the day as the week progresses. So this is going to take about the same as the differential. But in the end, the issue, if we're doing incrementals and differential, is going to be more related to how long is it going to take to restore the data if we need to restore it. So basically, we need to first restore the full backup and then restore the incrementals or the differentials up until we get to the point where we are today. The incremental, we're just going to need to load like the last day. So let's say it happens on a Thursday, so we're gonna load the Wednesdays the backup. Whereas with the differential, we got to do each of them. So we got to do the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, in order to get the things back to normal. So these are different considerations that I'm going to need to take under consideration. But this is all going to be based on the business impact analysis that I'm going to do to see how long do I have and how long can I afford to be down. And that's going to help me to justify, because obviously all of these things come at a cost. So really it's going to help me to determine and to justify, and then go to my management and say, okay, this is how much money we need for option A, option B, option C, etc. Thinking about the incident handling. So again, here our incident management plan. So we have to prepare, we have to identify, we have to notify, then we're going to be responding, then we're going to recover and follow up, and then we're going to be documenting what happened and reporting on the incident so that we can learn from the incident. The recovery from a disaster, so our DRP, our disaster recovery plan, we're really going to be looking at how can we establish an emergency operation center as an alternate location from which the business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan will be coordinated and implemented. So we're going to need to have a EOC manager, so the Emergency Operations Center manager, and we're going to need to determine when that manager should declare an incident in a disaster. So basically, something happens, it's an incident, and then we have specific guidelines at a certain point. We say, okay, this is a disaster situation now. So we need to activate the disaster recovery plan and move towards a business continuity plan. Activated the disaster recovery plan, our goal is to restore business operations and to return the operations to their original state as they were before the disaster. We're going to be required to operate in a reduced or modified environment. So we're going to need to suspend normal operations, identify the minimum recovery resources that we need to have, combine services, perhaps that were on different hardware platform, into a common server, and then continue to make backups because we're still going to be operating. The primary steps are going to be to ensure the safety of the individuals, then to contain the damages, and then finally assess the damages and begin the recovery operations according to the disaster recovery plan and the business continuity. So in order to recover or to restore all of the damaged systems, we need to know where all the configuration charts are, the list of inventory, the backups, the access control list. So basically we need to have some kind of folder somewhere. Obviously not just in the site that was involved in the disaster, so there needs to be offsite copies of these as well. Perhaps some of the managers can have them in their home in a safe, stored in a safe manner in their homes. Perhaps also if we have a hot site, if we have a permanent site elsewhere that we're going to be moving to, so copies of this information can be there. We're going to update the operating systems and the applications with the most current patches. We're going to make sure that the operating systems and the applications are current and secure. Then we're going to activate the access control rules, the directories, the remote system access, etc., so that people can get onto the new system. So some different alternatives that we have a dedicated site operated by us as a secondary processing center. We could have a commercially leased facility, such as a hot site or a mobile facility, or we can have an agreement with an internal or external facility. most common would be the third one, unless you're a large organization that has multiple sites. Let's say that you have 2 main locations in Quebec City and in Montreal. You can then have the likelihood that both would be damaged, that would be affected by the same disaster, is lower. So maybe that would make sense to go. You're going to be thinking at, the different types of recovery site options that you have, and you're going to be looking at, particularly the cost. So from a hot site, so a site that's 24/7 up and running, into which you can switch over in a few seconds. So if you're managing the electrical grid of a country, or if you're managing national security, or if something very critical that can't afford to be down, that would be the ideal situation. But the cost of doing that is very, very high. And so as you move towards a warm site, so partially functional, cold site, really not up and running, but ready to be switched over or set up in a matter of perhaps 24 hours or a few hours anyway. So if you have a plan, so that's sort of your spread between the hot, the warm, and the cold. So obviously the hot is very high, the warm has a medium cost, and then the cold site has a low cost. And of course that is directly related to how much equipment, what you have, how much staff you have at these in these different places. So as you can see on the table, definitely the hot site is a lot of reasons why it's the most expensive one. But the time to get it up and running is measured typically in minutes, whereas in the warm site we're looking at hours, if not days, and the cold site measured in days and potentially in weeks. Having multiple sites, obviously, which is more and more of a possibility now, particularly with the private clouds and different cloud environments. This is something that could actually be pretty much seamless. But it's although the cost itself is difficult to figure out, it's a major change from how things used to be done in the past. So, but I think is probably the way that most organizations are going to be going more and more anyway. So that was the lecture for this week. Thank you.